Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar today. For those of you who have not joined an info session before, these are hour-long webinars that focus on a specific topic related to the impact management project and aim to give you a concise set of guidance as you navigate your own impact measurement, management, and reporting processes. My name is Jo. I'm the engagement lead at the IMP. My role here today is purely facilitative. And I'll hand over to my colleagues Mike and James in a moment, who are running today's session on how to classify the impact performance of your portfolio. Before I do that, I'd just like to flag that this webinar is quite reliant on slides. So please try to join from a computer if you can. If you are on the phone, but could also do with the slides at the same time, please email me. That's Jo, J-O, at impactmanagementproject.com, and I will get those slides over to you right away. Otherwise, we'll be sharing the recording and slides shortly after this session. James, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're not on webcams today, but you can see what we usually look like. I am joined today by the Head of Investor Collaboration, Mike McCrellis, and our Impact Data Lead, James Hicks. They'll be taking you through today's presentation for the first roughly 40 minutes before we go into Q&A. And that part, we will unmute you, but it will not be a recorded section so that we can delve into your questions under Chatham House rules. That's everything from me. Mike, I'll hand over to you to take us through the agenda.
Great, thank you, Jo, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many people on the line. Excuse me. So during the following 40 minutes, what we'll do is I will start by putting essentially some building blocks out from the IMP consensus. So this is content that the IMP developed in the previous years through a consultative process involving over 2,000 investors and enterprises, talking to them about when they measure impact, what are they measuring? When they manage impact, what are they managing? And so when I say it's a consensus, it means that the way we got to this isn't just by having a handful of smart people in a room trying to think of something and then present it to the world, but rather by starting from what practitioners are actually doing and then playing it back to them and synthesizing until when we presented it to them, it resonated with everybody. So that's what we mean by when we say this is a consensus. We'll first cover the consensus on enterprise impact, the 5 dimensions of impact, data categories, and what we call the ABC. We'll talk a little bit about investor contribution, and then I'll hand it over to James, who will take these building blocks and put them together in the portfolio classification process. And then we'll turn to Q&A. So James, next slide, please. And next slide again. Great. So just to get some preliminary terms clear, many organizations have particular definitions that they use for the terms outcome and impact. But just to be clear what we mean by those terms in this context, an outcome is the result of an action or event, which is an aspect of social, environmental, or economic well-being. So if you're used to thinking about inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact, the output is what's within a company's control, and then the outcome is the point at which the output leaves the company's control, and actually it's something that's experienced by people out in the world or by the natural environment. In impact, we mean to be the change in an outcome, positive or negative, caused by an organization, directly or indirectly, wholly or partially, intended or unintended. And when we spoke with investors and enterprises, what we heard back from them is that impact has 5 dimensions. It's what happens, what is the outcome that occurs, is it positive or negative, is it important to the people or planet experiencing it, who does that outcome happen to, and were they underserved in relation to that outcome? So if the outcome is increased incomes, was it increased incomes for low-income populations or for medium-income populations? How much of the outcome occurs? So how many people experience it? How much of that outcome do they experience? How much does income go up? How long does it last for? the contribution. So is this outcome, is this something that would have happened anyway? Is this just something that everybody experienced regardless of what the enterprise did? Or is this something that the enterprise really uniquely caused to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise? So for people more coming from an impact evaluation background, this is the concept of the counterfactual. And finally, impact risk. This is simply, what are the risks to that the positive impacts that we expect don't come to pass, or that unexpected negative impacts do come to pass? And there are a number of dimensions of enterprise risk. So these are our basic building blocks. I do want to say it's not, we don't present this as being a one-stop shop or a silver bullet. This is just one piece of the puzzle. It's one element of a larger impact management approach of an organization that also includes many of the other frameworks and standards and principles out there. So it's quite complementary to other frameworks that you may come across. And I think it's useful, we've heard that it's useful for a couple of reasons. One is for organizations that are starting from scratch, that have not really tackled this question before, this gives you a sort of a checklist of issues that one way or the other you should try to cover in your approach, right? And for those that are further along the path and have already put an approach in place, many organizations may have covered, 60 or 80 or 90% of these issues just working on intuition and building something from scratch. But then, and using this as a checklist, they can see if there are certain pieces that they're missing. So James, next slide, please. This slide breaks those 5 dimensions of impact into more granular data categories. I won't belabor them, other than to just point out that this provides a way for each dimension of impact to articulate what constitutes more impact and what constitutes less. And this can be useful both to organize your own thinking about impact and also to increase the degree of alignment and shared understanding within your organization and even outside of your organization with external stakeholders about what you mean by impact. Next slide, please. So those are some of the building blocks. In the consensus building process, we also heard how investors and enterprises are using these building blocks to aggregate up to broader categories of impact. And that's what we have on this slide. So we have acts to avoid harm, benefit stakeholders and contribute to solutions. And you can think of these as being either intentions or goals that an investor might have or an enterprise might have, or you could think of these as ways of describing their performance, right? So starting from the left, well, from the far left, there's does or may cause harm. That you might consider that to be sort of business as usual or traditional practices. Acts to avoid harm would be investors or enterprises that either, maybe they don't have an explicitly social or environmental mission, but they want to be good actors. They want to behave responsibly. They want to mitigate risk. And they may also see opportunities to reduce financial risk and improve their financial performance by avoiding harm. Moving to the right, organizations that have some kind of a social mission, you could say, their goal is to benefit stakeholders. So, they may not be seeking to, move the needle on poverty, but they do want their products and services to have a positive impact on consumers, on employees, on the environment, and so forth. And finally, contribute to solutions. These are organizations and investments that are really geared towards tackling global challenges like malnutrition, poverty, inequality of access to education. Next slide, please. And what this slide does is it provides a way to translate from the building blocks of the 5 dimensions of impact into these broader categories. So, starting from the left, you can see the sort of may cause harm or does cause harm. And then in the middle, acts to avoid harm. These would be, reducing important negative outcomes, where what you're doing is likely the same or better than what would have happened otherwise, right? Moving a little bit further to the right, benefit stakeholders is actually moving into the domain of causing an important positive outcome. I will say that this is an intentionally lower bar, just recognizing how widespread it is that businesses are able to directly, contribute to better outcomes for people and planet. And we want to provide a place to catch all of those. And then on the far right, it's the contribute to solutions. And this one is intentionally a higher bar. So you can see in terms of the 5 dimensions, it needs to be an important positive outcome for an underserved population, which is different than the benefit stakeholders column. It needs to be a high degree of positive change and or for quite a lot of people or for a very long time frame. And there needs to be evidence that what's happening is better than what would have happened otherwise. So this is quite a number of conditions that need to be met, but this is to describe those efforts that are really geared towards, for instance, making a material contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And one thing that we hear is useful about this is that it provides a way to compare and contrast between enterprises and investments in very different sectors and geographies. So, how do you compare an education enterprise versus agriculture versus water versus health and so forth? And this provides a way to say, regardless of sector, regardless of asset class, there are some investments that are really addressing urgent underserved material needs in whatever sector they're in. And we can call all of those contribute to solutions. There's a whole other class that are doing some good, and we can call those benefit stakeholders. And then there are quite a lot that are acting to avoid harm, which is maybe more your traditional, ESG investing or corporate social responsibility and so forth. And so this provides a way to classify across asset classes and across sectors by the type of impact. Next slide, please. So those were the dimensions of enterprise impact. We will have an opportunity to come back to questions at the end, but in the meantime, we'll move on to investor contribution. This is, for investors on the phone, this is just a recognition that your job is twofold. You have to think not only about what is the impact of the enterprise in which you're investing, but also what is your contribution to that impact. And the impact of an investment is a function of both of those things. Next slide, please. In talking with investors, we heard that these are strategies that they use. There's 4 of them on the slide. We'll go through them one by one, but there's 4 of them. They're not mutually exclusive, and this isn't a hierarchy. It isn't to say that, it goes from least to greatest impact or anything like that. These are rather a set of strategies that are almost like tools that investors have in their toolkit. So the first is signaling that measurable impact matters. So this is simply taking impact into account in the investment decision-making process in your deal selection, underwriting, portfolio management, and exits. This is something that if all investors did the same, that would lead to a pricing in of social and environmental impact by capital markets. But given the fact that many investors are not doing the same, any individual investor, doing this may not directly move the needle. But at a minimum, you can think of it as being values alignment. This is a way to express an investor's value through their portfolio construction. And this is sort of the baseline that virtually all investors thinking about ESG or impact implement. James, if you could click to the next, thank you. So beyond simply signaling that measurable impact matters, many investors engage actively. So this takes different forms in private, versus publicly listed companies, but it could be using, your taking a role in governance and being on the board and connecting to the enterprise to, networks of customers or suppliers. It could be, proxy voting your shares if you're a publicly listed investor, or engaging in dialogue with companies. It could be, participating in industry-wide efforts such as this one. So those all fall under the domain of engaging actively. Next one, please. Thank you, James. Grow new undersupplied capital markets. This is where the investor's capital itself can directly be thought of as causing an increase in the ability of the enterprise to create impact. So these are, you could think of these as being quote unquote good deals that others have overlooked. You could think of this as creating new capital markets, but these are investments that cause or are expected to cause a change in the amount, cost, or terms of capital available to the enterprise, or to directly cause a change in the price of the enterprise's securities. And I see there's a question about, is this across equity or debt? This is across all financial asset classes, so both equity and debt. And finally, James, the last one. The last strategy is providing flexibility on risk-adjusted returns. So these are investors that are able to consider accepting less than market rate risk-adjusted financial returns in order to generate certain types of impact, typically contribute to solutions impact that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. And then, James, if you go to the next slide. Thank you. On the left side of here, we have the four strategies, and on the right side, we see combinations in which we see investors using these strategies. So starting from the top would be just signaling that impact matters. Then one down is signaling and engaging. The third one is signaling and growing new undersupplied capital markets. So this, while there's a risk that it's confusing, of course, but it does accurately reflect the sort of combinatorial nature of the way investors are creatively seeking to drive impact. And you'll see these 6 categories flow through in the following slides by James. Next slide, James. And I think this is the time at which I turned it over to James.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. So James here, and really great to be with you all today. So now we're going to bring these elements together, and when we do that, when we plot the impact of the underlying assets or enterprises against investors' contribution, we create this matrix where each box within this matrix defines what we call an impact class. And by impact class, I mean a grouping of investments that has similar characteristics in terms of impact performance. And you can see in each box here, we have an example of an investment archetype that resembles these characteristics. So within signal and benefiting stakeholders, we have a ESG fund that's positively screening and targeting best-in-class businesses that are benefiting their multiple stakeholders. And then in contribute to solutions and signaling and engaging, we have a private equity fund that is selecting and engaging businesses that are generating significant effect on health and education outcomes for underserved people, for example. It's worth noting here that investors' motivations might translate to several goals that span these categories, and equally, they may employ different investor contribution strategies with the different assets in the portfolio. So this means that when constructing a portfolio, it may span across several of these different impact classes. And we see these impact classes as being akin to financial asset classes in the same way that we group investments with similar characteristics in terms of financial performance. These impact classes group, as I said, investments with similar characteristics in terms of impact performance. And these impact classes serve as categories, not rankings. So just as we wouldn't say that bonds are universally better than equity, we wouldn't say that any one of these impact classes is necessarily better than the other. And this is because, of course, it depends, one, on the investor's particular motivations when they're making an investment, but also, crucially, to truly compare the performance at the granular level, you need to go a level deeper. And you need to look at returns within bonds or within equity and compare there. Or in this context, you need to look at impact performance within an impact class. So that's just a refresher on the overall picture of the impact class matrix. And now we're going to take this logic and apply it to a company and then roll our way up to that portfolio level. And to do this, we'll start with a company, and in particular a large healthcare company that provides a range of different products and services. And this company has conducted a materiality assessment. It's performed desk research, to produce a long list of potential material topics, and then conducted a survey of its employees, as well as it's interviewed subject matter experts from across the business, and also conducted surveys and interviews with external stakeholders. And this process has allowed them to narrow down to a list of impacts that are material to its multiple stakeholders. And now you may be thinking, well, many companies don't do this. And of course that is true. And it can depend on the size of the company and the amount of resources available. But this doesn't need to discourage us as investors or lead us to think that we can't move forward from this point, because when assessing a company's impacts on ESG issues, an investor still has the option to think through each of the company's main stakeholder groups, its customers, its suppliers, employees, local community, and so on. And as an investor, we can do this and make a reasonable judgment about what the most material impacts on these stakeholders are likely to be. And there's a wealth of information available, like analyst reports, media articles, even materiality assessments from other similar companies that can help with this. And in fact, as an investor, you may even have access to helpful information that the company doesn't even have themselves. I mean, you may have specific in-house research or experience gleaned from other parts of your portfolio, for example. But most likely, though, your assessment is based on lots of assumptions, and that's okay, because as long as the assumptions are documented and made explicit, they're testable. And this highlights that important aspect of impact management that was discussed on the last info session, namely that impact management is an incredibly iterative process. There's this constant cycle between making assumptions about impacts occurring, quickly collecting some data to help shed some light on whether this assumption has teeth, and if it does have some teeth, applying more resource to access better information and form a more complete understanding about the impact. And then we have that more complete understanding, we have a better chance of effectively managing that impact. In this case, though, our healthcare company has done its materiality assessment and come up with the 5 material impacts, and it has reported some limited data against these impacts. So let's look at the access to healthcare. Now, this company has a large portfolio of healthcare services and reaches over 20 million patients each year. And this particular material impact they've identified relates to its access to healthcare program, which has been running for a number of years now. The access to healthcare program has several initiatives, and among them are training new cohorts of healthcare workers in malaria care and delivering anti-malarial treatment. They have an early diagnosis and treatment of leprosy program. They have diagnosis and preventative medicine for hypertension, so meaning provision of high blood pressure screening and advice services in local shops. Now, it's provided limited disaggregated information on these initiatives, but it has provided some information and some supporting narrative. Now, those of you who participated in the last info session will remember this chevron diagram. It makes the distinction between efforts data, which is typically wholly within the company's control and therefore easier to measure, and impact data, which measures outcomes in the context of the other dimensions of impact. And outcomes, as Mike mentioned, occur at the point of interaction between the organization and the population or natural resource. So this means that they're typically harder to measure because they're partially within the organization's control. However, if outcomes are the things that matter, then we should strive to measure them if we can, because it's the ideal and most precise form of data. So when thinking about this company's access to healthcare program, it's worth taking a moment to consider what that ideal set of information would be to understand the program's effectiveness. Now, ideally, we'd want to know the patient's level of health after receiving treatment, the outcome level. We'd want to compare that against the level of outcome that is good enough to know if a positive outcome has been achieved. We'd want the patient's level of health before they received treatment, the baseline. And probably we'd also want to know additional characteristics, like exactly where these different initiatives are taking place, so the boundary. And we want to know how many people are experiencing this change and whether the effect is long lasting. And then finally, we would want to understand what other healthcare was available to these recipients and to gauge the company's contribution. So then we compare this ideal set of information to what we have in blue, and we can see that we have a figure for the number of patients reached through the healthcare program, so effectively a scale metric. We also have some additional notes from within the sustainability report, which describes that the program is running in 5 low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and the company is engaging with local authorities to establish the local healthcare priorities. And we do some more digging, and they note in one of their community-based hypertension improvement projects is in a particular region of Ghana where there is a high prevalence of high blood pressure. So in this case, when we think about the ideal set of data, it would be, we'd want to know the blood pressure of the patients before screening. We'd want to know, probably take another reading perhaps 12 months later to see if there was a change. And we'd want to compare this 12-month blood pressure to the healthy level. And ideally, we would have these types of specific data for each separate initiative the company is managing. Now, clearly we don't have that data now, so we're forced to make an assessment with the information that we do have. And when we do this, when we assess this impact and we read through the narrative disclosures of the different initiatives the healthcare company is running, we judge that they relate to important positive outcomes. And we think that based on the information we have and the areas reached, they are likely underserved in relation to the particular services offered. And therefore, they're also likely meeting an unmet need. The scale of the program is large at 5 million people. So in summary, we judge that this impact is contributing to solutions. Now, that comes, of course, with the important caveat that thinking through what the ideal set of information would be has enabled us to identify specific gaps in the data that we would need to understand the impact of this program effectively, excuse me. And so we're therefore taking high evidence risk on this classification. And so we can decide to proceed with that classification for now, but if we wanted to seek further information, we'd have various avenues to try and do that. I mean, we could go deeper into the research on health outcomes and see if we can find specific research that connects low income to poor health outcomes in the specific countries served. We could conduct analysis of other health programs that provide similar services in similar areas and get a sense of contribution. We could even make a targeted engagement with the underlying company and find ways to support them in collecting better data in the future, because not only is this information informative for an investor, it's likely to be decision useful for the company as well. So we've classified our access to healthcare impact as a C and contributing to solutions. And then we look across at the other material impacts and we perform a similar exercise. And when we do this, we find, somewhat unsurprisingly, that the company is a combination of many different types of impact. And it has some A's for act to avoid harm, and it has a B as well. It's benefiting its employees with decent wages. So this then poses the question, okay, well, what does that mean for this company as a whole? As we construct our portfolio, we need a way to classify an individual business or asset. And here we'll revisit that decision tree that we saw from the last info session. So what this diagram shows is that one reasonable way to think about pigeonholing a business as having a certain type of impact is to say, well, if an enterprise is acting to avoid harm, i.e. the business is acting responsibly, then it would be a collection of impacts that show reduction of negative outcomes. If some of those outcomes are positive, then it would not just be an A, but it would be a B. And then if it's not just acting to avoid harm and benefiting, but some of those positive impacts are reaching otherwise underserved people or the planet, then it's a C. And so in this case, our health company would be a C. So let's move on then, because we've formed an understanding of the healthcare company, but of course it sits in the context of many other companies, and each of those with their own sets of impacts. And as a fund manager investing into different companies, how should I understand the impact of my funds? Well, what we heard when we ran conversations on this is that if we treat the company as the unit of analysis, and then to understand the types of impact occurring in a fund, we look at the allocation across the different types of impact. And so in this case, on our first fund on the left-hand side, it's 30 million invested in a company that is contributing to solutions. It's 20 million invested in a company that's benefiting stakeholders, and it's 50 million invested in a company that's acting to avoid harm. And this translates to 30% allocation in C, 20% allocation in B, and 50% allocation in A. And similarly, doing the same analysis on our second fund, we have a 40% allocation in C, a 30% allocation in B, and a 30% allocation in A. And this logic continues up the investment value chain. If we look at a larger multi-asset portfolio that is invested in funds, and in this case, it's invested 50% in the left-hand fund and 50% in the right-hand fund, this translates to an allocation at the multi-asset portfolio level of 35% contribute, 25% benefit, and 40% act to avoid harm. So hopefully this diagram helps to demonstrate how, beginning at that very granular level and the level of the individual impact, we can ground our analysis in data, specifically social and environmental performance data, which likely varies in nature. It could be narrative, it could be quantitative, it could be data from a sustainability report or third-party research. Whatever the source, we can interpret that data using the 5 dimensions of impact. And then using the logic of the ABC, we can begin to tell a story of the impact that is happening at different levels of the investment value chain. But we're not finished yet, of course, because when we come to classify our multi-asset portfolio, we mustn't forget the other important component of the investment's overall impact, which is the investor's contribution. Now, in this case, our multi-asset portfolio manager is signaling that measurable impact matters with one of its investments. And then in the other, they are engaging as well. Perhaps they are providing in-depth support to this manager, or sharing best practices from elsewhere in the portfolio, or just generally helping them improve their impact management processes. Now, knowing the impact of our underlying assets as well as our own investor contribution, we can return now to those impact classes that I discussed at the beginning. And we can see that when we classify this particular portfolio, it is concentrated in the top 2 rows of the matrix. So collectively, it's 35% invested in contribute, 25% invested in benefit, and 40% invested in act to avoid harm. And this is split over 2 rows where the portfolio manager is signaling in one investment and signaling engaging in the other. Now, you can now use this as a picture as a way to describe the impact at the portfolio level, knowing, of course, that although this is a much simplified picture, it's supported by all those levels of analysis that sit beneath. And so before I wrap up now and sort of turn over for questions, I just wanted to go back to a diagram of those levels, because I wanted to be revisiting it, because you may be thinking, well, I can see how that could work if you imagine if you have information on all material impacts of all underlying businesses, but that just feels a million miles away from where we are in reality. And on this point, I tend to agree with you, but although I'm an optimist, and I think that these types of information are increasingly going to become available as existing standards evolve and regulatory tailwinds take hold. But for now, the picture when we look at our own portfolios, it may look something a bit more like this. When you look across the portfolio, you may be faced with a total lack of information on some investments, partial information on other investments, and reasonably good information on others. And then the depth of analysis that you go into then becomes something to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes you'll have performance data. It may not be perfect. Perhaps you've got gaps and some proxy data, but on balance, you assess that you have enough information on the underlying assets to classify based on performance. And other times it may be that there's so little information that you can't comfortably classify the investment based on performance. So instead, you look at the motivations of the fund manager, you look at their investment strategy, and you make a sensible assessment regarding what this strategy is likely to mean in terms of the type of underlying asset that they are investing in. Meaning, given their investment strategy, are they likely to invest in A, B, or C type businesses? And in other words, if there really is no performance information to go on at all, then you can classify a fund based on its expected impact or goals. And this is the kind of messy reality that we're faced with when we're trying to make sense of portfolio impacts in the real world. And what this thinking then does is just provide a logical construct to take stock of where you stand today and then set about prioritizing filling the gaps. And this is very much what the approach that was taken by PGGM. They weren't dissuaded by the threat of incomplete information, rather they got started and made sensible assessments across their entire 220 billion portfolio based on the information that they had. And you can see that they divided their portfolio into asset class groupings that were meaningful and decision useful for their own context. And then they set about classifying each. And this gave them a starting point to think about their impact at the portfolio level. And in some cases, they lacked complete information, and so they were then conservative in terms of the classification that they made. But overall, though, they found this exercise to be so helpful that they have incorporated this thinking into their investment policy statement and are now using impact classes as a way of reorienting their portfolio now and in the years ahead. So that then reaches the end of the presentation portion of this session, and welcome your questions as we move into them. We won't be recording the questions. I'll just end by saying that we've got a number of resources linked on the page here, which Joe will be sharing with you in the next day or two. Well, I won't go through them individually, but there's a number of links there that can be helpful for thinking through classification. And with that, I think we shall turn over to questions. Thanks so much for listening.